Yeah, the other question is whether we have, or we can ask for any students who are now connected, paper presentations. I think of 3 we've talked about, but are any students here thinking about paper drafts that we might present in the next few sessions? Or Alan and Jim, and have you spoken with any? The 3 I think of are Chinatown, Baltimore, and Oklahoma City. These were the 3 topics. Think of anything else?
Yeah, I heard about the Chinatown presentation. She contacted me.
Any others is my question.
I think we need to make formal announcement asking them to send us email.
Okay,
so I don't think
but nothing from your personal experience. Okay, and
no.
And anything from any students now who are connected who have yeah, I mean, Tong Wong has presented a bit already, and maybe anyone else who has anything in rough draft, or people who are working on MAs we may not have talked about. Any possible candidates? Okay, well, let's get started for now as people are still joining us.
We have a hand raised by So Jung Lee.
Okay, please speak to us.
Sure. I don't know if you remember my office hours with you about like Jakarta, Indonesia. So that was a potential paper topic. I don't have a presentable draft, but I'm working on crafting a rough draft. So if you want, I can do a presentation, or I can send a rough draft by the end of the week, or.
Okay, now that's great. Yeah. Why don't we plan on that probably for next Monday?
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you then. Anybody else? Okay. Maybe for continuity, Alan, do you want to follow up with, or let me introduce it by simply saying, after our session last time when we very too briefly talked about Wagner, Alan mentioned some of his own involvement, and this is all the more interesting precisely because he does not have a European German background at all. But tell us, Alan, how you got involved with this and what you're doing and how this can link with the more general course here now. Please.
All right. So last time when Professor showed us lots of videos about Wagner, I was thinking of all the things I have learned over the years on the German idealism, philosophers, all the way from Immanuel Kant to Fichte to Friedrich Schelling, then to Hegel, and in 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche, Arthur Schopenhauer, and all the rest. I was kind of a teacher teaching online some Chinese students about Western philosophy over the past 2,500 years, starting all the way from pre-Socratic Thales in Miletus to philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre in the 20th century. So I was pretty much involved in it because I was a teacher and I prepare a lot of stuff. So I was thinking about also Brendan's question about the association between Wagner and Nazism in the 20th century. And lots of people popped up in my mind, Friedrich Nietzsche. And I was actually a teaching assistant to a core course of the undergrads. And we had Nietzsche's book, Genealogy of the Morals. And I also dig a little bit on the history that Nietzsche's sister actually manipulated Nietzsche's works and catered to the Nazis' propaganda. So a lot of people, before Nazi were appropriated or misappropriated by Hitler or the propaganda department, possibly including some part of um, Wagner. So I was trying to come up with a more historical sense of this sort of trend all the way to the Nazism and the rise of nationalism. So I was thinking about the beginning point. I can, go back all the way to the beginning of Enlightenment, to what a professor talked about the public space, exemplified by the English coffee shop, where people discuss politics, forged these glorious, the Civil War in Britain and the Glorious Revolution in 1688, to Enlightenment. Many people say the origin of Enlightenment starts in Britain, from people like Thomas Hobbes, who had a more naturalistic bent, trying to use more naturalistic way to explain politics rather than some theological ways to explain politics. So I was thinking about the idea, the big topic today is Romanticism. I think all these people we talked about, they steep themselves with this romantic season, this big label that is probably the last big label of European cultural life, starting from maybe 1750 all the way to the middle of 19th century. So what I'm gonna do is to show you an author. This author's name is Sebastian. Maybe I should share my screen with you guys. Okay. Okay. So my thought was kind of related to this author. He wrote a book, The Rise and Fall of the Prussia. And this book was actually written in 1980, before the unification of West and Eastern Germany. But in 1981, the statue of Frederick the Great was re-erected in the Eastern Germany. So his association with Nazism was kind of praised, and many people found that this so-called soldier king was pretty enlightened. He was probably more enlightened than many other enlightened despots in Europe at the time. So there was a reappraisal of the Prussian soldier king, but also the reappraisal of Prussian history. Was it a militarized state bent on invading others, or is it just a using military as a deterrent, because Prussia at the beginning of its formation was so weak, landlocked, two-pillar states surrounded by many hostile European great powers. So this book is basically talking about Prussia was basically quite liberal under at least the Frederick the Great's watch, and censorship was quite loosened, and there was a general sense of religious tolerance because of the disaster of the 30 Years' War. The Holy Roman Empire was basically devastated. A large chunk of population were eliminated, with the devastation brought forth by the religious war and the use of mercenary. So because of all of these historical precedents, Prussia and Brandenburg, the two duchies, forged the core of what later became the Germany. So the book is talking about that, Prussia started out as a strong military state, not because of its ambition to invade other countries, but as an only way to survive in this pretty hostile environment, and also because of the history precedent of religious war and stuff like that. And also, Professor talked about that actually the Prussian soldier king, Frederick the Great, used Calvinism as a way to view the state. And it is also written by sociologists like Philip Gorsky at Yale University. And Frederick the Great is a Calvinist, and although his father doesn't want him to adopt Calvinism, he himself adopted and used it to build a state. And people speculate that he did this to spite his father. So anyway, what I'm trying to do now is to show you a document I used to teach some of my students. Most of them are high school students in China. And I was talking about this Romanticism 2 weeks ago. So I did all this illustration, and a lot of pictures were attached by me, embedded in the document. So maybe I will spend like 10 minutes talking about this whole stuff and connecting several people together, and possibly it will transition to what Professor talked about last week on the Wagner. So all these people are the children or pioneers of this great, probably Europe's last great cultural epoch, Romanticism. The catchword at the time were feeling, imagination, experience, yearning. And we're going to talk about Schelling in a few minutes. He had these words, he has this idea of world spirit, which is a very unique way to understand nature. It's basically dissolving the boundary between nature and your soul. This is a, he has a very unique way of characterizing nature, and his ontology is also very, idealistic in any way. So basically, all this is at the service of talking about the so-called national identity formation during the Romanticism period, and how this national identity first became a important state building idea or mechanism, and later on probably misappropriated and used for something related to Nazism. There are two strands of Romanticism. One is universal Romanticism. The typical location is Jena, and Schelling represents this branch of Romanticism. Another one has to do with the rise of cultural nationalism, the so-called national Romanticism in Heidelberg, represented by this philosopher Herder. So first of all, this is a big label, and this book, Sophie's World, argued that Romanticism is probably Europe's last great cultural approach, where people would speak some sort of thing as a common approach to life. And it's also a reaction to the Enlightenment, unequivocal emphasis on reason. So we probably have read Rousseau for most of you, for some of you who have the core in UChicago. Rousseau talked about, we should go back to nature. We have this noble savages who were corrupted by institutions and civilizations, but he doesn't want us to go back to that period. He just wants us to use some sort of, what he called the general will, the political democracy, or social, democratic government to reach the goal of personal freedom. Going back to some sort of more natural state of human beings. So at that time, that was 1750. It was only an undercurrent at the height of the Enlightenment. But in the 19th century, this so-called Romanticism became the mainstream of German culture. And all this stuff relates to Immanuel Kant on the philosophical reason. The philosophical reason was Kant was trying to say, well, we human reason cannot, understand, or it's impossible for human reason to get into the realm of the so-called thing in itself. This is his first book, his first critique on the critique of pure reason. He's trying to say that because our human reason has its own structure, there's a time space framework, and we have 12 categories to understand the thing itself. Therefore, there is a world of phenomena and there is a world of noumena. The noumena is something we cannot actually observe directly. It's outside of human reason. So because of this, many people in Germany say, well, if the thing itself is unknowable, why don't we just embrace the unknowable? It's something that human reason cannot get into, but we can just celebrate, this, the so-called the human artistic genius. So there we go. We have Beethoven, who is very different from the Baroque master Bach or Handel. Beethoven is more expressive, and his work is not focused on the glory of God, but rather this expression of ego. For example, Moonlight Sonata and the Fifth Symphony represent this kind of spirit. And Kant, although his third critique was very difficult to read, and it's not romantic at all, he was trying to say, well, beauty is something formal. Beauty is not anything like an object, but it's mediated by judgment, all this stuff. But in a way, it opened the door for the Romantics to embrace what Kant would call the thing in itself, the unknowable, the luminal world. So there we go. We have a couple of people in the then Germany, Schiller. He emphasized the free play of imagination. When we use our imagination, we are free. He was trying to say that sort of stuff, and he's also a good friend of Goethe. People like Coleridge, the lake poet, who influenced Emerson a lot, he is also a representative of this spirit. And in his poem, there are lots of episodes on the yearning for the unattainable. Like you pick a blue flower somewhere, and you cannot, like you wake up and you find the flower is in your hand. And in this period, there is some sort of romanticization of the Middle Ages. Such, spirit of honor was was picked up by some people again, and there was a fascination with the Oriental mysticism during this period, and the main actors are the urban youth. This is quite interesting. They are a little bit like students' movement in 1960s in the United States. They're anti-middle class. They are a little bit like hippies. In the 20th century, they think idleness is the ideal of genius and indolence the virtue of the romantic. People like Byron was a superstar at the time. He was basically not a good man by modern standards. He basically abandoned his two children, and he joined the Greek rebellion against the Ottoman. He was a sort of Greek Grecophile, representing this heroic personality. And in his public readings, he was mocked, especially by women, and spied by the equivalent of paparazzi today. And he had lots of poems talking about his unrequited passion. For example, he fell deeply in love with the distant cousin when his cousin Chadworth was married. he just wrote this piece of poem expressing this unrequited passion. So all these people represent that sort of spirit at the time. We can basically pinpoint the starting point at the middle of 18th century. That's at the height of Enlightenment. It lasted, for example, maybe for 150 years, all the way to, for example, Baudelaire's notion of flaneur. So all these people represent this big cultural label at Europe in that sort of period. So what I'm gonna do is to talk a little bit about the world spirit. And the idea is raised by Schelling. Schelling is probably the bridge between what we call the subjective idealism in Germany at the time, represented by Immanuel Kant and Johann Fichte, and the more objective idealism represented by Hegel. There are lots of misunderstanding of Schelling because his philosophy is so difficult to understand. But today we have a lot of people trying to write about him. For example, the very dangerous philosopher, but also popular. I mean, all these are big label by young students. He wrote about Schelling, and it was considered, and he actually was an inspiration to Sigmund Freud, because the so-called unconsciousness was first coined by Schelling. That was an interesting discovery from my reading. So basically, his philosophy on world spirit is dissolving the boundary between nature and spirit, matter and mind. He talked about nature is visible spirit, spirit is invisible nature, and the structuring spirit is everywhere in nature, and the slumbering intelligence is also in nature. He's basically saying that the spirit and matter are convertible. So I'm just drawing this picture, this Tai Chi, yin and yang kind of natural and spiritual world. Is not, the boundary is not set in stone. So in this cultural epoch, nature is considered a living organism, and people would rather go inside themselves and to find the inner world more than going outside and inspecting the raw matter. So they basically have very different approach to life compared with the Enlightenment thinkers. So I use a lot of picture of Avatar, the Hollywood movie, because I think this sort of nature as organism is very similar to what we see in the movie. And that's the first branch of Romanticism. But what connects what we discussed last week and the idea of Romanticism is another branch of Romanticism represented by Herder. He basically had a very different approach of using this national Romanticism to forge some sort of German identity. He had a very dynamic view of history, and he saw that history is characterized by continuity, evolution, and design, and he is not the type of nationalism on the political side, but more on the cultural side. So this is probably a Italian revolutionary who unified Italy in the middle of 19th century. But Goethe pioneered this Herder pioneered this national romanticism, during this period. So because of this, the Romanticism helped strengthen the feeling of national identity. But we also have to remember that the nationalism had its apogee during the Napoleon conquest. He was considered probably the last great captain at the time because he can use his sort of national feeling and mobilize people to support him in his conquest of Europe. So yeah, there we have the two forms of Romanticism, one based in Vienna, which is here in today's Germany, represented by people like Schelling. They worship nature, world soul, and artistic genius. The National Romanticism, based in town of Heidelberg, they focus more on history of the people, language of the people, and culture of the people. And the slogan at the time was, "Tell me where you live, and I will tell you who you are." And the similarity between these two is they basically think the nature is an organism. Plant is an organism, as well as the nation. A good example to connect to all this is the Brothers Grimm. They are not artists trying to write some fairy tales like Snow White, Seven Dwarfs. They are basically collectors. They compiled some folk songs, fairy tales in Heidelberg, and all these familiar fairy tales we learn in childhood are just folksy wisdom and folksy stories. So they are very different from Hans Christian Andersen. And one big thing that they did was through collecting all these folk songs and fairy tales, it created some sort of this imagined community, as written by a sociologist, how nationalism is forged. So these two brothers, they were critical in the formation of this common identity at the time. So just want to point out this very familiar people you probably know a lot about. So basically, this period was not only identified with lots of cool and philosophical kind of people, but also lots of artists and lots of reaction against enlightenment. And that's what I want to say. So maybe there were just a few more decades before we see Wagner's rise. But Wagner was also influenced by another philosopher, probably you know a lot about. That's Arthur Schopenhauer. I just found this opera, Tristan and Isolde by Wagner. And this composition was inspired by the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer was also greatly inspired by Immanuel Kant. He basically replaced Immanuel Kant's unknowable world, or the thing in itself, or the noumenal world, with this so-called will. And he thinks that the will is behind everything, and will make us suffer. And Wagner is highly, he was greatly inspired by Arthur Schopenhauer. And also Wagner has a friendship with Nietzsche, and then they had some sort of feud. So I was just trying to connect all this stuff and, reaching all the way back to Enlightenment, to the British coffee house, to what we talked about last week on Wagner and probably the rise of Nazi. I was just trying to connect some dots. Hopefully you get a little bit out of it. Thank you.
Okay, now that's all the more compelling because Alan, as you see, does not come from an American European background, but is distilling this for use globally with students in China. Similarly, I held up before a recent book. This is the art exhibit at the Smart Art Gallery, but there's another book and more by Larry Norman, professor here, of French, and the French use most of these same sources that Alan has summarized. So if that's the past, and the one point is that this in turn formed many of the ideas that Wagner built on. If we go up to present, let me just mention something. And unless Brandon, are you right there? Are you there now, or maybe not?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Do you want to mention, or even, I mean, I've got it in front of me. I can either read the section on the Alex Ross New Yorker piece, unless you have it and want to say anything about it yourself. Okay. Alex Ross, renowned New Yorker music critic and author of the international bestseller and Pulitzer Prize finalist, The Rest is Noise, reveals how Richard Wagner became the proving ground for modern art and politics, an aesthetic war zone where the Western world wrestled with its capacity for beauty and violence. For better or worse, Wagner is the most widely influential figure in the history of music. Around 1900, the phenomenon known as Wagnerism saturated European and American culture. Such colossal creations as the Ring of the Nibelung, Tristan and Isolde, and Parsifal were models of formal daring, myth-making, erotic freedom, and mystical speculation. A mighty procession of artists, including Virginia Woolf, Thomas Mann, Paul Cézanne, Isadora Duncan, and Louis Buñuel, felt his impact. Anarchists, occultists, feminists, and gay rights pioneers saw him as a kindred spirit. Then Adolf Hitler incorporated Wagner into the soundtrack of Nazi Germany, and the composer came to be defined as his ferocious anti-Semitism. For many, his name is now almost synonymous with artistic evil. In Wagnerism, Alex Ross restores the magnificent confusion of what it means to be a Wagnerian, a pandemonium of geniuses, madmen, charlatans, and prophets do battle over Wagner's many-sided legacy. As readers of his brilliant articles in the New Yorker have come to expect, Ross ranges thrillingly across artistic disciplines, from the architecture of Louis Sullivan to the novels of Philip K. Dick, from the Zionist writings of Theodore Herzl to the civil rights essays of W.E.B. Du Bois, from O Pioneers to Apocalypse Now. In many ways, Wagnerism tells a tragic tale. An artist who might have rivaled Shakespeare in universal reach is undone by an ideology of hate. Still, his shadow lingers over 21st century culture, his mythic motifs coursing through superhuman films and fantasy fiction. Neither apologia nor condemnation, Wagnerism is a work of passionate discovery, urging us toward a more honest idea of how art acts in the world. Okay, so in that, the point is a couple more general points and then push on. People are asking about these questions because the arts are dramatically increasing in their salience. And I pointed to the USC campus where we had minimal focus on the arts 10 to 20 years ago, and now they become one of the central themes of students. Nationally and internationally, surveys show, I presented this at the beginning, it is in the Scenescapes book, it's in the other things we're working on. There's a decline of all kinds of civic organizations, from unions to some churches, certainly in Europe, and now more recently among university graduates. Churches are even in declining in membership. The huge exception is the arts. The arts and culture activities are rising in salience, importance in many people's lives. And so where and why does this fit with the various pieces is what we're trying to ask. Okay, with that as background, let's shift to some of the bigger theories. And the main theory is what many regard as the most important formulation concerning the arts, at least more generally, let's say the artistic treatment of myth and the linking of the global themes which may be found in Australian Aborigine myths, in the background of the sort of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, or in Hollywood films. And how does this come together? This is the point of Claude Lévi-Strauss' 4 volumes on myth, or mythologique, as was the title in French, and it's been translated in a couple of different ways. And so we have the raw and the cooked on our reading list here, and I read this when I was a student in France, of these transformed the thinking of some people in Paris at the time. If you look today at the work, the publications of American and English-speaking, even anthropologists, you find that they virtually never discuss these 4 volumes. They're too much out of step with what I won't try to go into where and why, except to say that we shouldn't just ask the anthropologists. This is too important for people to ignore more generally. Okay, the two big points that are in the 2 selections that we have in the reading list are, first, from basically he doesn't call it he uses musical terms, so instead of calling it a preface, he calls it an overture. And with the big point here is what he made earlier in his book in 1955, Tristes Tropiques, namely that the isolated jungle tribe is dead, or has simply become part of the globalized world, that it is no longer isolated. And in that sense, people are using iPhones and watching television in the Brazilian jungles as they are in small towns in rural China. Similarly, it is impossible for an anthropologist to go to a jungle town and write about an independent culture. All the elements of cultures are overlapping in more complicated ways. And so in that sense, we can learn from the diversity of at least the path, more independent construction of these myths by little bits of societies, tribes, and others that had different myths and different social relations among them. And that's what the 4 volumes elaborate. They go through a huge number, hundreds and hundreds of individual myths, which he has distilled mostly from the Americas, mostly Latin America, mostly Brazil, but also he has a book on North American Indians and their myths and how they fit with these same kinds of themes. So point 1, he's building what is, at least by an aspiration, a more universal kind of formulation of where and how not just myths, but more generally texts, ideologies, strong views about what's right and wrong, good and bad, and how we live, in a sense, the Brothers Grimm, Wagner, and more. More specifically, he also mentions in the overture section that the main inspiration for these 4 volumes was the work of Richard Wagner. So as a young man, Lévi-Strauss was overwhelmed with the same kind of Romanticism, which you found discussed in these multiple works. It ended, or it destroyed itself, because you had both the French and the Germans, to some degree the English, all driven into war over national identities in ways that ended up basically destroying European culture in terms of its global salience and importance. It was replaced by the U.S. and then more the Russians, and then Chinese and others, and more others in more diverse manner in subsequent years. Nevertheless, in terms of our thinking about the arts, this was an absolutely critical period, in that there were more smart people thinking and trying to make sense of the arts. And Levi-Strauss continues that in ways that we can build on the best work. I asked more recently the top expert on myth at the University of Chicago if she had anything to add of major significance since Levi-Strauss, and she gave me one book she has. Think of her name in a second here. On the spider, basically, but the basic answer is no. That Levi-Strauss is basically the state of the art in terms of this kind of thinking. So that's one. These are three interrelated points as background. The second is to just see briefly some of the structure of what he does. And so Alan has a couple of pages here nicely ready, and we'll just scroll through. And what he does is codify hundreds of these myths, and he numbers them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then he looks at slight variations in them. So he takes the jaguar, and then how the jaguar's wife acts, and then how the jaguar's wife is treated in different myths, and where and why these roles of the woman and the wife differ from one myth to another. So M7 is myth number 7, etc. So just scroll down a little bit on, or we're not going to go into any detail, just to show some of the picture. Okay, here we go. So this is good. So we have jaguars, intermediary, human beings in that kind of box. What he does is typologize whether the male and female are friendly or hostile, and then why is the female hostile instead of being friendly and lovable. And so so in a sense, he starts with the myths and the content of the myths, but then he moves up and outside to build the structure, the scene, as we've called it through the course. And of course, the term scene in the Scenescapes book build on explicitly Wagner and Levi-Strauss specifically, as Levi-Strauss created, based on his work before myth, is what made him famous, was a book called The Elementary Structures of Kinship. And so as an anthropologist and in smaller societies, kinship are among the most important social arrangements that is, we don't have highly developed capitalism, manufacturing, unions, we don't have things like that. Families and family relations and who marries whom becomes absolutely critical. And so where and how you can have people who are emotionally attracted to cousins, and whether they're permitted to marry their own cousins or whether they have to go further, becomes a critical differentiating characteristic of different tribes with their respective myths. And so Levi-Strauss, just to simplify, just scroll on down a little bit more here, if you will. So we have roles: the origins of wild pigs, the trickster, which is a classic Western image of evil becoming more incorporated into the court, becoming more incorporated into Shakespeare and the like, into the jokester, into the comic, and to the clown. So for the last circle, the marching of the people led by the clowns in the Fellini final scene, in a sense, is a continuation of the transformation of the clown. And Fellini's answer to these big German Romanticism philosophical questions is just follow the clown. Okay, listen to the music and go in a circle. So his ring, Fellini's ring, is quite different from Wagner's ring. So we have, in a sense here, the wife giver and the wife takers based on these transformations and how the first pair, the role of the jaguar, the role of the pig, the human and the animals. We have, in a sense, what he's doing is taking the kind of material that Wagner, the Brothers Grimm, and others have in their myths, and then trying to say, how can we build a more coherent, more general theory? And so if we take the Oedipus myth, which is so well known among Westerners, Oedipus is fighting with his father, and he has to push the rock up for his entire for the rest of the world, as long as he's mythically alive, because he seduced his mother. And so the relationship between, that is the love of the mother in Oedipus, in some of these myths, is repeated in similar manner to Oedipus, where you have a patriarchal society. The father is then resented. The source of authority is revolted against. Conversely, if you have a matriarchal society where women tend to be more dominant, and they are the source of authority, and their families are the structuring principle of the kinship ladder, then we have instead women are treated as bad, or at least authoritarian, and so you have myths about men having to carry a woman on their back their entire lives, and the woman then beats her husband. She tries to kill him. She tries to have fish eat his feet off when they go into the water, and things of that sort. So you have the transformation of the content of myth based on the family structure and surrounding it. All right, that's enough for now, given the time which we have. What I want to do then is to briefly switch forward as time is going on, and talk about another big classification of cultural types, which is Daniel Elazar's The American Cultural Matrix. This is one short paper focused just on the US, but it summarizes 25 books which he wrote on political culture, and 25 more books which he wrote on the history of the Jews. Here's a little picture of Elazar briefly, with his beard there. He was the father of a rabbi. He was a rabbi himself. He had a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, and was brilliantly innovative in developing some of these ideas. The classic idea, to simplify, going back historically, was the model of the Sermon on the Mount, when Moses goes to the mountain and meets with God and returns with the 10 commandments by which you must live, or the people must live. A core element not only of Christianity and Judaism, but close to what you have in martial arts studios, which are even Korean and Chinese in cultural background. So the broader cultural perspective is that there are three big types of cultures, and they move, and the cultures move with people as the people migrate from different origins, geographically and culturally. So we have these summarized here briefly. Within the US, or that is within Europe, we have Calvin, and the Calvinists are the source of the New England moralistic in the middle column. This is Calvinism. The traditionalistic comes more from the Church of England, or the Roman Catholic Church in a sense, and the individualistic is less religious, but more Central German, Central European elements of Protestantism there. Okay, so you have here beliefs, conceptions of activities, how the bureaucracy is treated. So just scroll on down a little bit. We're not going to go through detail, but just show that there are answers to each of these kinds of views of who should participate, who are the natural leaders. And in New England, in the Calvinist manner, typified as well in the Netherlands, there is no leader. it is not the church that can appoint. It is rather the members of the church who choose their own aldermen. And so the aldermen, using that term in Chicago as well, came from the choosing of the ideally unanimous participants. Say, this is a great map. Yeah, let's show that map, please. So these are the migration patterns of the three types. So the heavier, bold-faced New Englanders migrated largely west, but also a bit into elements of the South. And Faulkner even talked about the definition of what he was writing about as Puritanism under the Southern sun. And so the Puritanism typified most dramatically in Salem, Massachusetts, and in Nathaniel Hawthorne's woman who had an A for adulterous on her arm and who was punished for life for having committed a sin, typified the degree to which moralism of the individual, the church, and the family also interpenetrated politics and all of life, that there is no such thing legitimately as separating out these distinctive issue areas in that sense. And so you have this in stronger versions of feminism today. You have in Massachusetts political candidates more frequently and in more salient manner, continuing even in the primary debates in Elizabeth Warren, for instance. Contrast that with Texas. And so Texas at the other extreme, or Mississippi, has a very different style of politics, which comes from slavery. I mean, the background of the South is slavery as an economic base, and the hierarchy of slavery, where there was one person or one family that was the boss, was not democratic, was not participatory, it was the opposite. And so that style is not totalistic by any means, but it certainly marks a dramatic contrast, an oppositional contrast with New England. So what this is also saying is, don't look for a general American culture, look for the key components and where they are fighting with each other, as in political primaries and elections, and as these candidates go around and give speeches in different parts of the country. They have different speeches they use. In between is the Middle Atlantic, the individualistic, typified by what's opening today, the New York Stock Exchange. And so the market, the deal, the individual contract, the art of the deal is the title of Trump's most important book. Seeing this in isolation and atomistic separation from the rest is part of the inherent view of this third political culture. Okay, if those are those three, let me just, okay, yeah, let me hesitate for a minute. Any questions on some of this that I'm covering right now, or among the pieces that we're trying to show you how they fit together? As we near the end of the course, you should have a coherence now of joining these elements, which goes from the 19th century Romantics into these contemporary subtypes, which we can even find in primary debates and in different ways of using the arts. I'll just add, for instance, that during the Puritan Wars, the English reversed the general position which was discussed by Habermas in celebrating the stock market and so forth, and not being so focused on the arts. But during those puritanical wars, the English became much more strict and closed the theaters even. And so in that sense, the political sensitivity was so great that when the political so instead of being just a national historical labeling, Habermas's general point is that if you have a political system that is hierarchical and overwhelming, such as more strongly than he observed, Stalin, Mao, these then hold back the expression of diversity in cafes and other kinds of contexts. So a quick point I'm making is try to join all of the pieces of the course, not just for studying for the final exam, although obviously that will help. But what I most appreciated when I was at the end of studying for individual courses and for an exam, or especially the PhD comprehensive exam, I had a sense of how the whole set of pieces finally came together with not an total integration, but at least enough of a synthesis that I could feel instinctively how the pieces felt together, how they came together. And you get some of this in Alan's presentation of searching for these ideas of what was the big European idea. And he I think he did it very nicely in saying this was the last major European cultural creation, was Romantic nationalism, even though it ironically destroyed Europe as a world leader. So in that sense, it is tragic, just as in Wagner's Ring, but it illustrates then the continuations in different ways. Even if his name is not acknowledged, we see it in Hollywood, we see it in advertising, we see it in the superheroes, and the idea of the artistic genius, etc. Okay, the third starred reading, just 2 minutes on that, and then we can come back if we want, if there's time later, or not. I can leave it for you to read. The third starred reading is The Cities and Entertainment Machine, and this emerged because of the effort to say the arts are clearly rising, but what do we know about them? So the effort, like the Levi-Strauss book, is how can we build a theory? And so what the book does, The Cities and Entertainment, does is to review the main theories specifically about the arts within a social science context. So what do anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, economists have to theorize about the arts? And the general answer is damn little, that very few of them have ever worked seriously and thoughtfully on the arts. And so Brandon and I are struggling. He's with his own PhD proposal right now. Me and a handful of people around the world are seriously working on making these kinds of connections. But most people resent it. They say, oh, you're not doing enough of the arts, or you're not doing enough social science the way we like it. And so it becomes difficult. We don't have that much data compared to production. Consumption is much more limited. So the book is not just about the arts. It's more generally about consumption. But as China is moving, China and all of the Asian countries that are based on this idea of export economy production, and they're shifting away from that to domestic consumption, this is massive, and it's transforming the world in ways that have not been appreciated outside much of Asia as much as it should be. I've talked about this a bit, but what the book does is to go through and pull out a number of specific propositions. Where did I put the book here? Well, I'll skip it. But that is, they're propositions about religion, they're propositions about general values, they're propositions about more specific things. So for instance, the idea of Veblen and Bourdieu or of Louis XIV, we can say, was building Versailles was a dramatic, conspicuous consumption, showing that I'm the most important king in the world and attracting the dukes and others from across France so that they would come here for the fireworks, the poetry, the concerts, the theater, the intrigues, the court intrigues, the affairs, the novels, the gossip about all of this that was going on, as well as trying to get political appointments, favors, money, contracts, etc. All that went on in a highly personalized, clientelistic sort of climate where the arts were more central and more publicly discussed than was politics. Politics was the mood of the king. It was not something which could be voted on or anything discussed explicitly, in contrast to Hobbes, Locke, and others in the English cafes. So in that sense, the conspicuousness, as Louis XIV said, was chose très nécessaire. The conspicuousness was a critical, necessary part of the arts and consumption. Okay, Bourdieu uses this core idea in his distinction book, and others then have criticized as saying, yes, that's one. And so what I do in the Cities and Entertainment, we should say, no one of these propositions is deterministic. No one thing explains everything. For some people, some of the time, like Louis XIV, or more perhaps in Paris, and some people around Bourdieu, conspicuous consumption may explain a lot. In other places, it may explain nothing. And so in the Adorno-Horkheimer essay on Hollywood, we have instead economic capitalism as the driver. And the preferences are imputed from the owners of capital by Adorno and Horkheimer in the essay. But in fact, if we look more closely, this seems to be a quite weak part of the argument. But more generally, the point is that there are many theories, many launched, presented in a deterministic way, such as Louis XIV wants conspicuousness, and that's the arts. If instead of accepting or discussing that as in such a deterministic way, we say, what are the 30 things that the arts can do? Then we get to the leitmotifs of Wagner. And so Wagner's 30 different themes can then be joined in different kinds of artistic colorings and flavorings and contexts. And as we saw in the interpretation of how those themes work together, we have illustrated in the art what Levi-Strauss then makes into science, of saying these are structured relations of love, of hate, of jealousy, of anger, of revenge. And these differ for reasons which we can begin to systematize if we look at cross-cousin marriage and other things of that sort. Okay, so my point is the book and the codifying, looking over many of the past theories sound deterministic, but if we see these, and as we've seen in the readings, we don't need to read or interpret them in such deterministic way, but can try to see where and how these can shift. So the last, well, two other readings. Let me stop for a little bit, and we can, if we want to, we can talk about the other stuff we haven't discussed so far today or the next session, contingent on how many students we have who may want to present. Okay, reactions, comments on what I've said from anyone, and as well as what Alan said as they overlap. We had several good questions the last few times. I'm looking at names here of some of you who've Madison Pearson, I think you had some good points. Are you connected right now?
Yeah, I can ask a question. Can you kind of go into Wagnerism, like with superhuman films. I don't really understand the connection there.
Okay, yeah, that was, I was just reading stuff from the blurb on the book. This is a salient, very interesting, it's a great question about the role of Jews and anti-Semitism, because New York intellectuals have sometimes been described as distinctly Jewish in culture. There's a terrific book on 4 of the top New York intellectuals and the role of Marxism in their worldviews as Marxism then changed from the 1930s up to the present, with Daniel Bell, Glazer, and others, arguing the world is the name of the video, the film, the website, the book, and that's one kind of theme. Okay, so what was the role of, and they wrote in terms, their style was to treat world history as sort of continuing on at the City College of New York, and we can understand not only, and so that there was Alcove 1 and Alcove 2. Alcove 1 was Stalinist. So this was orthodox Stalinist Lenin Marx. Alcove 2 was Trotskyite. So it was Marxist, but it was more open, debating version of Marxism. Okay, in the 1920s, you had, I mean, in the interwar years, you had the Germans lost World War I, the English and the French forced, I mean, the Americans opposed, but they finally gave in, and the English and the French sort of bled the German economy. The Germans responded to repaying their fees with creating massive inflation, so they could pay off a certain dollar amount to the French and the English in deflated German marks. But at the same time, this meant that the consumer within Germany could buy less and less and less and less. And so this in turn created an economic background which led to militias, especially communist and Nazi, fighting each other through the 20s and 30s. And in turn, you then had the American and the English reaction, what should we do? And so the English reaction in 1937 in the Munich Accord was to leave the continent to Germany. The Americans, similarly, led by the Chicago Tribune, and Irish priests flew around in the Chicago Tribune and others, this amazing stuff. Isolationist. We don't want to get involved, and we the Irish don't want to defend those damn English. That, you know, if the Nazis go into England, too bad. And so that was the American dominant perspective until 1941. However, the debates were huge, and there was a great concern, distinctly so, on the part of New York Jews, who were against the Irish in that sense, and the New York Jews wanted to fight Hitler. And so how can you mobilize, how can you fight against the Chicago Tribune? And the visible artistic legacy of the Chicago Tribune was the comics. So Dick Tracy, etc., were there in comics. And so what was done in the 1930s was to create, and there's a terrific series of videos and so forth. The Marvel company, that's the corporation, funded and built a series of Superman. I can't name all the names of the superheroes, but you may know them better than me. But the superheroes were created by Jewish artists and intellectuals in New York in the 1930s to transform the old American cowboy. We no longer had cowboys in the 1930s, and we didn't want to just fight the Indians. They were gone. We wanted to fight Mussolini and Hitler and Franco. And how can we do that if we're far away? We can be the individualistic cowboy who can be one superhero, and you can go with your magic ring or your flying this or that, and you can you can fight those Nazis and you can beat them. So this was part of building mobilization for the war effort in ways that took over some of the art, the mysticism, the excitement, and put it into comic books and comic strips, and then comics as separate little booklets, all of which had a Wagnerian background, if you will, but were artistic, and they joined the music, and that is later on with Hollywood, they joined the music of the movies, the action, and these continue to be classic classic themes or classic films, which are rolled out again. Superman 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, Dick Tracy, et cetera, et cetera. That's the quick answer. Similarly, okay, I'll stop there on that. But anyone else want to either elaborate or explore? And so how this then continues on is with social media but the joining of the arts in ways that I'm eager to see what Alex Rose has to say. But there's a vast amount of work on this, and I'm not stressing, as you can see with Alan's presentation, just Wagner, but the background of Herder, and the point which maybe he didn't make was that Germany at the time, in a sense, America was not engaged in the 1930s to fight. America was separate. Germany separately, similarly in the 19th century, was not a nation. Prussia, Bavaria were separate states and regions and principalities. And so the nation of Germany was created by these artists that he described, the Grimm fairy tales, Wagner, etc. They created the sense of a unified German nation and German people and German spirit. And in that way, these were put together by Bismarck in creating the German state around 1870, plus fighting the French as the main competitor, led to mobilization after a successful war. And that led to great pride by the Germans, and the French felt so crushed that they adopted many domestic institutions inside France, like they reformed the university to do research, because the French university did not conduct serious research in the 1870s. So they added a whole branch of what's now called the CNRS, National Research Division, as well as separate sections of the university to do research, as well as high school teacher preparation, which is what Durkheim did. Okay. Other comments or questions on? We're looking also, think for yourself and ask questions about integrating themes or ways that if you see something that we've read or talked about that does not fit, let's talk about it. Let's try to pull the pieces together in cumulatively and collectively. Anything else like that, Madison, that's in your mind? I mean, that was a great question, which ironically which also, if you will, there are many. I mentioned Barenboim in the book on Barenboim in Israel. That is, particularly among Jews, Wagner is a super controversial figure, and yet the power of the music, the beauty, the contribution which it made, and then of course the New Yorker magazine, writing this book at the same time that you're in the center of New York culture and you're the editor of the New Yorker, the music editor of the New Yorker, makes this, could not be a more controversial topic. If you go to the Auditorium Theater today, the main place where it's the largest theater in downtown Chicago, there are about four images of faces, Shakespeare, one or two others, and then the names are up above them. The fourth face is Wagner, but there is no naming him. Okay, that's the partial erasure. That illustrates iconically and metaphorically the role of Wagner in 21st century, the 21st century world. And so Alan has helped ironically restore from a young Chinese perspective, taking this to other young Chinese who are trying to learn about all of this. Okay, other questions or comments? Yeah, just while you're there, Madison, do you see anything else that doesn't seem to connect in anything that you've read or heard us discuss here?
Nothing really off the top of my head. That is a question that I just asked that I've had for a bit that wasn't sitting right with me just because I didn't see the connection, but your explanation really helped a lot. But if I think of anything else, then I'll definitely bring it up next time or shoot you an email.
I mean, the other name, in addition to Brunhilde and Siegfried, is of course Nietzsche, and so Nietzsche's concept of the superhero or the you know the god-like figure. I mean, the more than macho kind of conception of the individual, the Superman, was really his kind of term, and so that in a sense was background for the superhero comics in New York, who are now also obviously popular all around the world. But look, if you want, just look on the web for say the New York creators of the superheroes in the 1930s, and there are terrific discussions among the people who themselves were the original artists and where and why they did this to try to get Americans involved in World War II.
Just like one funny Chicago thing that I learned a few years ago. So there's a Goethe Street on the near north side, like the German writer. And I guess during World War II, that anti-German sentiment was very high. So they started pronouncing, if people know how Goethe is spelled, it's Goethe, I think. So people started pronouncing it Goethe Street rather than Goethe to kind of like de-Germanize it. And if you haven't realized this, you'll find, if you spend enough time in Chicago, you'll realize that people kind of, especially older people, tend to call things names of things they wore a long time ago. So.
Just one small correction. It was World War I, not World War II.
It was World War I, I'm sorry.
And the direct connection was that the German government actively funded many activities, concerts, lectures, libraries, bookstores all around the world to spread German culture in this worldwide ambitious manner. And it was this was the most active cultural activity across the US, basically, and especially in cities with a significant German population. And so to have that then all end with the beginnings of World War I in 1914, where whatever it was, 14, 15, that is, World War I led to the US government prohibiting this kind of foreign intervention into domestic. And so the name changed at that time, and Germany just became another ethnic group, so-called.
Yeah.
I'll even mention just as a sentence for those of you who are, say, can get intrigued by Chicago's history and variations of this, and to show how the Tocquevillian manner of New England that Elazar described was not a Chicago tradition. Instead, the main groups in the 1830s and 1840s, when there was an earlier version of Trump, whose name was Boone, B-O-O-N-E, I guess, and I think he was the grandson of Daniel Boone, who created the coonskin cap with the, he became elected mayor of Chicago with the Know Nothing Party around 1830 or so. And his main program was to fire the immigrants who did not deserve to have their names and activities visible in Chicago. So specifically, to fire the Irish from the Chicago Fire Department. And then, as well as now, that was big stuff. And so was he opposed by civic groups? No, the main organized groups were more like Germany in the interwar years, and they were called militias. I heard this from a PhD on the Chicago militias, and the biggest militias in Chicago were the Irish, and there were multiple Irish militias, and the Germans. And when Boone announced this, some of the Irish militias started to march on City Hall. So Boone called out all the police, overtime people he could have, and he still was hugely undernumbered. So he persuaded some of the German and Irish militias to work with the Chicago police, and they did, and they were large enough in number that City Hall was not taken over. and he continued. But if you think we live in an anarchist, politically fragmented and ideological time with Trump as president, imagine having militias marching on the White House in Washington, or let's say, etc. So we've gotten a little bit more civilized in some ways, at the same time that there's a lot of violent background, and as Stokely Carmichael used to say, violence is as an American tradition as apple pie. Okay. Who else has a comment or question? Oh yeah, we're actually near the end, so I will say let's continue. We will be in touch with at least 3 or 4 of you on papers, and we'll have papers and Q&A on the session on Monday, and on Wednesday we'll do a review session of the whole course for the final exam. So try to synthesize, pull the pieces together, ask about the comics and how they fit with the rest, and so forth, and we'll try to help you out with that effort. Okay, thank you, folks. We'll see you Monday. Okay.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Please do.
So I'm writing the paper on Oklahoma. Should I plan on creating a PowerPoint for Monday if I present?
If you want, what do you have that that you're thinking of how to present? I guess what is there new beyond the? And you don't need to do much at all but that is, tell us what you have in mind presenting, and we can talk about it together right now.
Sure. So let me just pull up this here. So I am talking mainly about the metropolitan area projects in Oklahoma City, or the MAP projects, which really revitalized the city. And so I was thinking of doing a PowerPoint presentation and kind of walking through the main points of my essay. And then I would be able to also provide pictures that I've taken of downtown.
Okay, I mean, that sounds good, but how does it relate to the obesity theme, or health, or walking, or something? Is that can you keep that front and center?
Yeah, I can definitely keep that front and center. MAPS is just kind of how I'm tying it to a lot of other themes that we've talked about in the class, like Flender, the ability now for people with sidewalks put in place because of MAPS, that they can walk around and they can experience the art that's downtown that's been put in, and things like that. I'm trying to tie a lot of things together.
Okay, no, that sounds perfect. That sounds perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, that is, talk about masks and tying things together. Brandon has just published a paper, which, Brandon, what if we keep in mind in background, if you want to say just a few words about your story in
the Reader.
In the Reader, just so maybe flag it with a link, and just to show that it's a way that it's a challenge to localism, but it is there in ways which Madison is going to show you how it's was or being overcome in Oklahoma City. Is there any other, yeah, actually, maybe even with Madison there, I'll ask, is there any other bigger kind of summary, synthesis, integration that we might try to do, either as a PowerPoint or to have us talk about in some way that would pull these pieces together? In a sense, what Alan presented today did that for my very brief introduction of Wagner. In a sense, I didn't link Wagner with, with the Brothers Grimm and national integration or the cultural, the fundamental sort of cultural contribution in 19th century Europe, which you did very forcefully and well, Alan. Are there anything else like that in terms of big pieces or big, in a sense, Levi-Strauss is doing that, but the propositions do that, but I'm looking for ways of propositions in the city as an entertainment machine. And this, I mean, the syllabus tries, but it may be more fragmentary. So I'm thinking for ways of doing this, either for the ambitious, conscientious student who's read everything, at least with stars, and scattered bits of more, as well as the person who has not read very much. And how might we appeal to both of them in ways that can show how the connections join? Anybody have a suggestion?
I mean, this may not be possible or like work, but it's like when I remember when I was like preparing for prelims and stuff, and the prelim, and like putting everything in like chronological order, and then being like, oh, this person's responding to this person's responding to this idea, but like kind of having like family trees or something in that way, but that may be too, I don't know how to do it with something like as diverse as all of this stuff.
Yeah, as you started talking, I thought even of your central path diagram in your proposal. As, I mean, if we were we were in France talking about Bourdieu, I'd almost say let's feature that. For that it's perfect, but it doesn't go beyond. It doesn't go far enough in. Well, yes and no. It's another point was made by this as a reader of the German Marxist interwar intellectuals, making the point that there is no Marxist cultural policy in a consistent, coherent way. That is, individual countries, individual leaders like Stalin of Mao, but even means Mao himself, dramatically reversed and changed what was good and what was bad within a few years, even while he was before and afterward the father and of the Cultural Revolution. So in that sense, it's all Marxism, but the point is it's not determined. It wasn't written out by Marx in terms of which kind of cultural activity is consistent with the proletariat or the even a Leninist or a Stalinist economic program, that the arts have a certain amount of autonomy. And so some of the most, okay, so I'm making that simple point. That is, what I'm saying is that some causal arrows can be zero or both plus and minus in ways that are not predetermined or general. That is, they depend. So whether the arts are anti-Semitic or celebrating the Jewish legacy depends on things which are not necessarily part of Marxism, for instance. Um, anything else you wanted to add or ask, Madison?
Well, I guess I can kind of I think my essay, I was planning on expanding past just the obesity and more into like just things that I have, equipped with the knowledge of the class that I can pretty clearly see in Oklahoma City, like such as the amenities and how much that has changed just within my lifetime and since my parents have moved to central Oklahoma. The buzz downtown, how different cultures are shifting in and out of different parts of the city. Like the rule of 10 can definitely be applied in Oklahoma City. And then I was also thinking about the Murrah building bombing, which occurred 25 years ago, and how that has really changed, the United States even more broadly than Oklahoma, just as the largest act of domestic terrorism in the United States. Yeah, so I guess I kind of have a lot of ideas about how I can apply things to Oklahoma City, and I'm happy to do so. But if there's something specific you think I should focus on, then I can definitely shift and focus on that.
Well, no, thank you. If we have as few as maybe 4 students, maybe we ought to, and it sounds as if what you've done is now take some core course ideas in answer to my question 5 minutes ago and apply them to Oklahoma City. If you've got slides that help do this, maybe we ought to, not say focus just on obesity, but how the arts more generally have been important in transforming Oklahoma City and place making, which is the whole theme of the course, which would be great.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I feel very strongly that there's a lot of things I can pull from the course and apply to Oklahoma City. So I can send you a draft of my slides if you'd want to see them before class on Monday.
Great. Now that would be great, please.
Okay, I can do that. Okay, this has been very helpful, actually. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. For noticing the Oklahoma case and for elaborating it for all of us. I'm eager to learn more.
Thank you. I'm excited to present. So thank you again. Have a wonderful evening.
Okay.
You too.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Okay. What do you say, guys? What do we still have to discuss? Anything about the grading, or is that pretty much settled at this point?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much.
Yeah,
pretty much
actually,
settled.
have you turned off the recording, Alan?